What if fame wasn't fortune, but a countdown to collapse? They had the faces, the spotlight, the primetime slots, and then bills, bailiffs, and bankruptcy. This isn't about fading careers. It's about public figures privately falling apart while the cameras kept rolling. From Golden Age icons to game show kings, these are the stories they never told on air. Because in British showbiz, the curtain doesn't close. It just stops being paid for. 15 stars. One shared fate. Welcome to the other side of the spotlight. Before we dive in, if you're into untold stories, fallen stars, and the strange poetry of public collapse, hit subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Let's see who else is out there, listening in the dark. 1. Diana Dors. She was sold to the public as Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe. But if Monroe had been reborn as a tax-dodging clairvoyant with a swimming pool full of debt collectors, you'd get something a little closer to Diana Dors. She was a blonde bombshell with cheekbones that could slice glass and a life that eventually crumbled into overdraft fees, scandal, and a suspiciously missing fortune. Dors rocketed to fame in the 1950s, armed with a sultry persona, tabloid charisma, and a voice that hovered somewhere between seductive and, "How much is this costing me?" She played the bad girl, the misunderstood girl, and occasionally, the girl sent to death row. But behind the camera flashes, her financial reality was unraveling like a cheap feather boa. She lived fast, spent faster, married men who could generously be described as bad at math, and she maintained a lifestyle, cars, clothes, parties, even seances, that required a small nation's GDP to sustain. Eventually, the inland revenue came knocking. In the late 50s and into the 60s, she was widely reported to have been caught in the web of unpaid taxes and chaotic bookkeeping. It wasn't just a money issue. It became a public fall from grace, repackaging her from glamorous icon to minor TV curiosity doing game shows and gossip slots for cash. To be clear, the bankruptcy was real, not just whispered about in the backs of green rooms. She'd gone from Hollywood glamour to hustling for relevance. And by the end, there was talk of a hidden fortune, secret codes, and a mysterious stash that might never have existed. Diana Dors died in 1984, but the legend of her missing millions still floats around like a ghost in shoulder pads. Her rise was silver screen gold, her downfall, a cautionary tale printed in red ink, and it would set the tone, quite literally, for the next generation of fame-driven finances gone fatally sideways. 2. Stanley Holloway. Before you knew him as the lovable Cockney Alfred P. Doolittle from My Fair Lady, Stanley Holloway was just another performer who learned the hard way that being one of the chaps didn't mean the taxman wouldn't gut you with a smile. Stanley was a master of charm, rhythm, and monologues that could stretch the English language into operatic comedy. A staple of the stage and screen through the 1930s to the 60s, he had the sort of career people toast: long, varied, successful. But hidden beneath the bowler hat and booming baritone was a story of early financial collapse that most people, understandably, forget. In the late 1920s or early 1930s, when the world was still trying to figure out if it was broke or just hung over, Holloway was declared bankrupt. It wasn't a rumor. It's documented in his biographical accounts. A little line that sits awkwardly between "then he joined the concert party" and "next he became a beloved national treasure." The official reason? Tax problems. The unofficial one? Likely a mix of underestimating the inland revenue and overestimating how long a music hall career could fund champagne evenings. But Holloway did something that many in this lineup failed to do. He bounced back. Not in the "I bought an island" sense, more like, "I learned my lesson and took the next 40 years seriously." His bankruptcy was a derailment, not a death sentence. He rebuilt, slowly, humbly. with roles that made him a household name without ever really screaming, "Look at me, I'm rich again." There's a strange humility in his downfall. It wasn't melodramatic. It didn't end in scandal. Just a quiet legal hiccup that rerouted a man toward a more careful version of success. But that doesn't make it less mysterious. Because if someone that beloved, that measured, could slip so early in his career, then maybe fame itself was never the safety net people thought. And the next name on the list? He was slicker, darker, and in the end, a cautionary figure for how charm can't outpace a casino chip. 2 down, 13 to go, and the stories only get stranger from here. If you're still with us, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this beautifully uncomfortable descent. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? Are you wide awake or just trying to fall asleep to the sound of someone else's downfall? 3. Dennis Price. Dennis Price once played a man who murdered his way to aristocracy with a velvet voice and impeccable tailoring. That was Kind Hearts and Coronets, 1949. A satire in which he, as Louis Mazzini, charmingly bumped off an entire noble family to climb the social ladder. In real life, Price didn't need to kill anyone to taste success. But keeping it? That was another story. His own descent wasn't theatrical. It was slow, sad, and lined with pawn slips. By the mid-1940s, Dennis Price was the toast of British cinema. Slick, handsome, and just cynical enough to be interesting. He specialized in the sort of men who wore cufflinks while plotting something unspeakable. But beneath the sophistication was a growing financial ruin. By 1967, he was legally declared bankrupt, a matter of public record and a whispered warning within the acting community. The cause? A mix of extravagant living and gambling. He bet big and lost bigger. Unlike Holloway, Price didn't bounce and back cleanly. His later years were marked by work that felt less like a career and more like a scramble. Low-budget horror films, foreign co-productions, roles that made you wonder if his agent had stopped returning calls. There's a line in Kind Hearts and Coronets where his character says, "It is so difficult to make a neat job of killing people with whom one is not on friendly terms." You could say something similar about financial collapse. It's much harder to recover when the damage is done by people you once trusted, including yourself. Biographers mention the bankruptcy as a turning point, not just legally, but existentially. The illusion cracked. The man who once played murderers with immaculate posture died in 1973, well before any grand redemption arc could roll around. His name lives on mostly through that one perfect film, where he played a man clawing his way upward, blind to how far there is to fall. And the man who comes next? He didn't just fall, he vanished in plain sight, his name forgotten by most, but his story trailing off into something eerily quiet. 4. Ronald Lewis. If Dennis Price's bankruptcy was a long slide into gloom, Ronald Lewis's was more like a last act that never quite got written. A leading man in the 1950s and 60s, Lewis had the kind of face directors liked. Strong, serious, vaguely haunted. He appeared in everything from thrillers to costume dramas, always on the cusp of real stardom. And then, like a stage light quietly dimming mid-scene, he was gone. Ronald Lewis's downfall is one of those sad, slow burns that rarely makes headlines, but lives forever in footnotes. By the early 1980s, he was no longer the face of any franchise. His screen time shrank, the jobs dried up, and in 1981, the paperwork caught up with him. He was declared bankrupt, with debts publicly acknowledged and reported in biographical sources. Not speculative, not rumor, just hard financial ruin, etched into public record. What caused it? The usual suspects, declining career, personal chaos, and drinking that biographers refer to with increasingly grim overtones. He'd gone from red carpet to rejection calls, and the bankruptcy only confirmed what insiders already suspected. Ronald Lewis was done, financially and professionally. A man who once moved effortlessly across film sets was now weighed down by creditors and a reputation nobody wanted to touch. What makes his story especially haunting is the absence of noise. No scandalous divorce, no public breakdown, just a quiet fade into irrelevance, with bankruptcy serving as the final, reluctant headline. He died not long after, in 1982. The connection between his financial collapse and his later despair is noted in several accounts, not graphically, but suggestively, the kind of ending that leaves a silence heavier than applause. Ronald Lewis's story is less about losing money and more about losing momentum, that invisible currency actors trade in. And while he faded quietly, the man who follows did the opposite. He exploded with charm and indulgence, only to gamble it all away in one of the more flamboyant collapses you'll hear today. 5. Wilfrid Hyde White. If there were ever a man born to play the genteel, slightly befuddled Englishman, it was Wilfrid Hyde White. He had that unmistakable voice, half port, half pipe smoke, and a presence that made you believe he'd never known a day of hardship in his life, which is exactly the trick. Because by 1979, this ambassador of upper-crust eccentricity was officially declared bankrupt by the Inland Revenue. This wasn't a youthful indiscretion or a brief stumble at the start. No. Wilfrid Hyde White was a fully established screen presence by the time the taxman came knocking. He'd already been Colonel Pickering in My Fair Lady, had featured in The Third Man, and could have reasonably expected to live out his final years doing dry comedic cameos and sipping something expensive in Monte Carlo. Instead, he was back in the papers, not for another charming role, but for owing more than he could pay. Biographers point to reckless spending, gambling, and that classically British refusal to take money seriously. He wasn't flashy, but he was careless. The kind of man who would host a dinner party without quite checking if he could afford the dinner. There are mentions of tax exile stints, of quietly moving abroad when the sums got too grim. But no dramatic speeches. Just a quiet declaration of bankruptcy and a dignified shuffle toward lesser work. The irony is cruel, of course. Hyde White specialized in playing characters who didn't understand how the world worked anymore, kindly relics of an empire long gone. And in real life, he seemed to inhabit that same fading aristocracy. The man who once dined with movie royalty now had to navigate the world of repayment plans and tax hearings. But unlike some, he kept acting. He kept appearing, always with that same air of bemused detachment, as if none of it quite applied to him. And maybe that's how he survived it. Still, for all his composure, his story was a warning. Even the most polished lives can be quietly unraveling beneath the surface. And then came a man who knew exactly how to perform charisma, and exactly how to misplace a fortune. Peter Wyngarde's collapse wasn't quiet. It was flamboyant. It was strange. It was very him. 6. Peter Wyngarde. Peter Wyngarde didn't just play characters. He became cultural archetypes. His most iconic role, Jason King, the velvet-clad, mustachioed adventurer from Department S, was a figure so outrageously stylized he practically walked off the set and into the 1970s as a walking meme before memes existed. Wyngarde was charm on a cigarette end. Men wanted to be him. Women wanted to decode him. He was everything fame could amplify and everything finances could destroy. His rise was a perfect collision of camp and cool. By the early 1970s, Wyngarde was a bona fide television icon. His face, all smirk and swagger, was plastered across magazine covers, and his wardrobe looked like it had been designed by a Bond villain with a theater degree. But the fame had an expiration date, and Peter missed the memo. In 1982, the bankruptcy was filed. It wasn't whispered or rumored. It was formally declared, legally documented, and publicly reported, according to sources, the trigger was a disastrous investment in a country farm. A bold attempt at reinvention that landed with all the grace of a cocktail umbrella in a hurricane. He'd poured money into the property at the precise moment his earnings evaporated. That farm? It never delivered, and the income from his heyday couldn't keep up with the lifestyle he'd designed around it. The bankruptcy paperwork became the final punchline. Jason King, brought low not by spies or scandal, but by mortgage payments and the unglamorous realities of land ownership. Wyngarde's later career was patchy, his public image tinged with the bittersweet air of former glory. Fans remembered the charm, the voice, the swagger. But the industry remembered the risks, the debts, and the man who'd flown too close to the velvet sun. His story lingers not just for its eccentricity, but for the underlying question it leaves behind. What happens when the persona you've built becomes too expensive to maintain? Next up is a man who learned that question the hard way, not with velvet jackets and country houses, but with bricks, restoration dreams, and a feathery sidekick named Emu. 7. Rod Hull. There are few British entertainers more surreal than Rod Hull, and there are none quite as memorable for bringing chaos to primetime television via a rogue puppet with a temper. His infamous sidekick, Emu, a wide-eyed, wing-flailing menace, became a national sensation in the 1970s and 80s. Emu attacked celebrities. Emu mauled talk show hosts. Emu made Rod Hull famous. And ironically, it was everything outside of Emu that made Rod Hull bankrupt. In his heyday, Hull wasn't just a novelty act. He was a cultural phenomenon. He hosted his own shows, sold out theaters, and occupied that strange middle space in British stardom where you're on television constantly, but still somehow financially precarious. He wanted more than slapstick, more than the puppet. He wanted legacy. So he bought a crumbling 17th-century manor house in Kent, a sprawling romantic ruin that looked great in brochures and worse in invoices. Hull poured his fortune into restoring the property, new roofs, stonework, historic preservation, but the dream bled money faster than Emu could maul a talk show guest. By 1994, the illusion shattered. Rod Hull was declared bankrupt. The cause? Not scandal, not extravagance, just the simple, crushing weight of a historic building and the taxes that came with it. According to reports, the bankruptcy was severe. The house, once a symbol of personal ambition, became a financial albatross. His marriage ended. His career, already in decline as TV tastes changed, took a harder hit. For a while, Rod Hull became the man who used to be famous, remembered mostly through retro clips and pub anecdotes. And yet, he did stage something of a comeback. Post-bankruptcy, Hull reappeared on screens, leaned into nostalgia, and tried to revive the magic. But something had changed. The twinkle was dimmer. The Emu attacks more choreographed. Fame, once an effortless ride, was now a grind. Hull died in 1999 and Emu was briefly revived by his son, a passing of the puppet, if you will. But the legacy remains bittersweet, a man who entertained millions, undone not by vices, but by bricks and taxes. And while Rod's collapse was real estate tragedy, the next star's downfall was all about numbers. Game show numbers, business misfires, and the cruel calculation of being worth less than your catchphrase. 8. Ted Rogers, 3-2-1. That was the phrase. That was the gesture. And for a few golden years in the 1980s, it was all you needed to say for millions across Britain to know exactly who you meant. Ted Rogers, host of ITV's smash hit game show 3-2-1, was a Saturday night institution. Snappy, smooth, and moving at a pace that made coffee nervous. Rogers had the timing of a Vegas comic and the stamina of a prizefighter. Week after week, he danced through riddles, contestants, and dusty bin like it was second nature. But beneath the showbiz patter and perfect suits, Ted Rogers was not built for failure. And when 3-2-1 ended in 1988, the fall came quickly. By 1992, Ted was declared bankrupt. The reasons were familiar but still striking. a failed business venture, and the abrupt collapse of income after his show was canceled. One minute he was the face of ITV, the next, a cautionary tale. The game show world is unforgiving. Once the format dies, so does the host's financial oxygen. According to later accounts, Rogers had tried to pivot, producing shows, dabbling in other ventures. But the numbers didn't work. He was reportedly left with repossession threats and mounting debts, though not all of those details are firmly sourced. What is clear is that the bankruptcy was real, public, and humiliating. And for a man whose whole identity was built on being quick, sharp, and unflappable, it struck at something deeper than just bank accounts. Ted Rogers never quite escaped the shadow of 321. The catchphrase outlived the man. He continued to work here and there, but never with the same spotlight. The bankruptcy remained a footnote, but a loud one. His story isn't just about a fall. It's about how television can build a kingdom around you, and then delete the set overnight. And if Rogers was a man undone by ratings and risk, the next name on the list faced something colder. The tax man, the headlines, and a public who never let him forget what he owed. 9. Jim Davidson. For a long stretch of the 1980s and early 90s, Jim Davidson didn't just have a career, he had territory. Saturday night television, game shows, primetime slots that felt untouchable. Big Break alone turned him into a household fixture, the kind of presenter who seemed permanently installed in British living rooms, like the sofa or the remote control. Money followed. A lot of it. And like many who rise quickly, Davidson assumed it would keep coming simply because it always had. But fame ages faster than people expect. Audiences drift. Formats expire. And somewhere between the final applause and the next tax bill, reality intrudes. In Davidson's case, it intruded with paperwork. In the mid-2000s, he was declared bankrupt after failing to keep up with repayments on a large back tax bill. This wasn't tabloid exaggeration. It was straight reporting by major outlets. The tax debt was real. The declaration was formal. What makes Davidson's collapse particularly instructive is that it didn't happen at the end of his career. He was still known, still recognizable, still talked about, which made the bankruptcy sting more. There's a special kind of public discomfort reserved for people who are supposed to be rich but suddenly aren't. Davidson became a walking contradiction, a man associated with mainstream success, now openly negotiating financial failure. Unlike some on this list, he didn't disappear. He continued to perform. He continued to tour. But the narrative shifted. The presenter who once embodied light entertainment became someone defined by controversy, polarizing opinions, and a very public reckoning with money. Bankruptcy didn't end his career. It reframed it. Every appearance afterward carried a subtext. This is what happens when the taxman eventually catches up. Davidson's story sits at an uncomfortable crossroads of fame, entitlement, and arithmetic. It reminds you that no matter how many laughs you generate, no matter how long you dominate a time slot, numbers still matter, especially the ones you owe. And while Jim Davidson's fall was loud and argumentative, the next story is quieter, more introspective. A woman who spoke openly about shame, survival, and what it feels like to rebuild when the cameras are still watching. 10. Sherrie Hewson. Sherrie Hewson's career has always been built on familiarity. She wasn't the distant kind of star. She was the one who felt like she belonged in your front room. From Coronation Street to later ensemble shows and daytime television, Hewson projected warmth, resilience, and a sharp wit that made her easy to trust, which made her financial collapse all the more jarring. In 2007, Sherrie Hewson was declared bankrupt. She didn't hide it. She didn't dance around it. She talked about it publicly, about the stress, the embarrassment, and the way bankruptcy still carries a social stain no matter how common it becomes. According to her own accounts and press coverage, the causes were a mix of divorce fallout and financial mismanagement. Not extravagance, not scandal, just life, unraveling faster than income could stabilize. For a working actress, bankruptcy isn't just about money, it's about reputation. There's a quiet fear that once it's on record, producers will see you as unreliable, as risky, as someone with baggage. Hewson confronted that fear head-on, reframing her story not as failure, but as survival. She kept working. She kept appearing. And in later years, she became something else entirely. An example. What's striking is how differently her story plays compared to others on this list. There's no vanishing act, no tragic fade-out. Instead, there's an uncomfortable honesty about how quickly things can collapse even when you've done everything right. Hewson spoke about feeling judged, about the lingering shame, and about rebuilding slowly, deliberately, without illusions. Her bankruptcy didn't erase her career. It reshaped her public narrative into one of resilience rather than ruin. But it also underscored a harsher truth. Steady work doesn't guarantee steady security, especially in an industry where contracts end abruptly and personal upheavals ripple outward financially. And if Sherrie Hewson's story is about rebuilding with dignity, the next name on the list reminds us that sometimes bankruptcy doesn't come after fame fades. Sometimes it arrives decades later, when the spotlight has already moved on, and the safety net is long gone. 11. Anita Harris. Anita Harris once epitomized the multi-hyphenate glamour of British entertainment. Singer, actress, cabaret star. Her presence in the 1960s and 70s was elegant, composed, and seemingly untouchable. She lit up stages with a kind of vintage charm that felt immune to time, appearing in everything from carry-on films to West End productions with the poise of someone who knew the rhythm of fame and how to ride it. But time is a quiet accountant, and in 2015, decades after her cultural peak, Anita Harris was declared bankrupt. The case was reported by major outlets, not a rumor, not a misunderstanding, but a legal reality. The public reaction was less scandal and more a kind of collective pause. Anita Harris? Her? No dramatic headlines preceded it. No financial meltdown made the front page. The bankruptcy seemed to appear, as these things often do, like the final note in a song you didn't know was ending. Reports pointed to personal financial distress, though the exact causes weren't paraded through the tabloids. And perhaps that's what makes her story more affecting. There was no collapse in reputation, no criminal proceedings, just a deeply human reminder that even the most polished careers aren't immune to silent debts and slow decline. Anita's case fits a recurring theme in this list, the danger of the long tail. Even when fame fades gently, the financial expectations it creates often stick around. Bigger homes, bigger bills, and a lifestyle that outpaces what the phone calls offer. By 2015, the disconnect between past visibility and present income had become unmanageable. Still, she endured. There's no record of her retreating from the public eye, no scandal-laced vanishing act. Her bankruptcy didn't erase her legacy. It merely reframed it. Less untouchable icon, more real person trying to hold everything together long after the applause had dimmed. And now we move from genteel distress to a different kind of unraveling, one that unfolded not in the quiet corners of showbiz, but in the full glare of soap opera fame, courtroom headlines, and a very public loss of control. 12. Peter Adamson. In the world of British soap operas, few faces were more familiar, or more embedded in the national subconscious, than Peter Adamson. For decades, he played Len Fairclough, the gruff but likable builder on Coronation Street, a character so tied to the fabric of British television that it seemed almost impossible to separate the man from the role. But Peter Adamson's fall was brutal in its clarity. In July 1991, he was declared bankrupt, a fact reported with the cold formality that often follows such legal endings. The debts were real, and the causes were traced to a perfect storm of legal fees, personal hardship, and the long tailspin of a reputation in freefall. Adamson's bankruptcy wasn't just a financial event. It was a terminal punctuation mark in a career already bleeding relevance. Years before the bankruptcy, His name had become entangled in tabloid controversy, and though not all of it resulted in legal consequences, the public image damage was enough to sever ties with Coronation Street and turn him into an industry ghost. Work dried up, opportunities vanished, and with them, the income needed to sustain a life once built on dependable TV royalty. What makes Adamson's case particularly stark is how complete the collapse was. Many on this list went on to find second acts, character roles, nostalgia circuits, memoir. But Adamson's bankruptcy marked the end of his public narrative. After 1991, there was no meaningful return to the screen. The soap star became a footnote, his most iconic role preserved in reruns, while the man behind the character struggled quietly on the margins. It's a bitter kind of irony. The builder from Coronation Street couldn't rebuild his own life. And while the bankruptcy was reported without sensationalism, it spoke volumes. This wasn't just a financial low, it was a final curtain call that arrived years before the obituary. And next, another Coronation Street legend, but one whose bankruptcy didn't end a career, just changed the way the nation saw him. A star who went from courtroom victor to financial casualty and carried the contradiction in every headline that followed. 13. William Roache. William Roache didn't just star on Coronation Street. He was Coronation Street. As Ken Barlow, he appeared in the very first episode in 1960 and went on to become the longest-serving soap actor in the world. For generations of viewers, he was more than a character. He was a symbol of continuity, of tradition, of the strange immortality that only television can grant. But even national institutions have bills to pay. In April 1999, Roache was declared bankrupt. Unlike many celebrity financial collapses, his didn't come from extravagance or mismanagement, at least not in the traditional sense. It stemmed from something far more ironic, a courtroom victory. Roache had successfully sued a newspaper for libel and won. But in the wake of that win, he pursued further legal action, and the cost of those proceedings proved to be his undoing. The expenses mounted, the legal landscape shifted, and suddenly, the man who'd just been vindicated in court found himself exposed to fees he couldn't cover. The bankruptcy was widely reported. It wasn't speculative or whispered. It was front-page stuff, TV legend and financial peril headlines that painted a picture both surreal and painfully grounded. How could someone that famous, that enduring, be bankrupt? Roache never left the screen. He kept playing Ken Barlow through it all, showing up to work while navigating a financial storm off-screen. And maybe that's what made his story resonate. It wasn't a collapse. It was a contradiction. A man playing stability on screen while living instability in real life. The public response was a strange mix of sympathy and disbelief. This wasn't a scandalous fall. It was more like watching a beloved institution quietly spring a leak. And yet, the cameras kept rolling. Roache kept acting. And the street, fictional though it may be, carried on. But while William Roache weathered his financial storm with a stiff upper lip, the next story is heavier, more modern, more raw. It's about a man caught between ongoing legal battles, rising debt, and the harsh glare of fame that never quite lets you off the hook. 14. Michael Vell. For many viewers, Michael Vell is inseparable from Kevin Webster, the trusty no-nonsense mechanic on Coronation Street. He joined the soap in the early 1980s and stayed, decade after decade, through storylines both mundane and melodramatic. He became part of the furniture, a steady fixture in a fictional world that felt increasingly real to its loyal audience. But off-screen, Vell's life told a very different story. In January 2018, he was declared bankrupt. The event was not some vague rumor or behind-the-scenes murmur. It was formally reported by credible news outlets as a court-ordered bankruptcy. The causes were layered but painfully familiar. Tax debts and mounting legal costs from a series of prolonged legal entanglements that had haunted his public image for years. Vell's case underscores the financial whiplash that can follow a very public trial. even when the verdict ultimately clears your name. The fees, the press, the time off, work, the reputational bruises, they all stack up. And in an industry where steady paychecks rely on continued screen time, the interruption becomes its own punishment. By 2018, he owed more than he could pay. The bankruptcy didn't just affect his finances. It shifted the public perception of a man long considered safe television. Suddenly, the character everyone trusted was linked with terms like insolvency and debt recovery. It didn't help that Coronation Street itself was moving into a more modern, faster-paced era. Nostalgic loyalty only stretched so far. Still, Vell remained on the show. Like Roache before him, he didn't disappear. But his presence came with a different kind of weight. Viewers no longer saw just the mechanic in overalls. They saw a man balancing two realities: the security of fiction and the instability of real life. There's a kind of quiet tragedy in that. Fame doesn't pay the bills, not by itself. And for Vell, the role that once promised stability became the backdrop to a very public unraveling. But the final story on this list belongs to someone who symbolized an era, not in soap operas or sitcoms, but in style, music, and the raw ache of cool gone cold. 15. Magenta Devine. In the 1980s and early 90s, Magenta Devine wasn't just on TV. She was TV. Or at least the part of it that knew what Joy Division sounded like and didn't care if your collar was ironed. With her signature dark glasses, severe fringe, and monochrome wardrobe, she was less a presenter and more a walking mood board. A symbol of British counterculture wrapped in dry wit and sonic youth. She made her name fronting shows like Rough Guide and Deaf 2, delivering travel tips and cultural commentary in a tone that felt half bored, half divine. She didn't shout, she smirked. And in doing so, she carved out a space entirely her own. A woman both aloof and magnetic, a broadcasting presence you couldn't quite pin down. But behind the carefully curated cool, life was far messier. In 2003, Magenta Devine was declared bankrupt. The news was reported quietly but factually, a legal event rather than a media storm. Still, it marked the unraveling of a public figure who had once stood at the exact intersection of style, music, and modernity. Her career had already slipped into a kind of liminal space. Less prominent roles, fewer TV appearances, and the bankruptcy made it official. The era had moved on, and she hadn't been invited to follow. Her financial troubles were described as part of a larger personal struggle. Not gaudy or dramatic, just slow, cumulative loss. The kind that doesn't make headlines but makes life feel smaller. She had once reported from Tokyo and Berlin with a voice like late-night radio. Now she was navigating insolvency paperwork and shrinking margins. What's striking is how little noise her bankruptcy made. No big tell-all interviews. No televised apologies. Just a quiet fade into the footnotes of pop culture, remembered best by those who'd lived through the same era, or wished they had. Magenta Devine died in 2019, never quite reclaiming the spotlight, but never fully leaving it either. Her image remains iconic. Her voice still floats in old clips, and her fall, like so many in this list, came not from scandal, but from silence.